Commander Zekthor stepped off the transport shuttle and felt Earth's gravity settle around him like a heavy blanket. It was stronger than his homeworld, but not uncomfortably so. He stretched his forearms and looked around at the military installation before him. The buildings were old by galactic standards, made of stone and brick rather than the advanced materials his people used. Everything looked primitive and outdated. A human in a crisp uniform approached him with measured steps. The man was shorter than Zekthor by at least a foot, which was typical for this species. His face showed age lines around the eyes and mouth, and his hair was cut extremely short in the military fashion. "Commander Zekthor, welcome to West Point," the human said, extending one hand. "I'm Colonel Marcus Webb, Commandant of this academy." Zekthor had studied human customs before this trip. He reached out with one of his lower arms and grasped the colonel's hand, shaking it, as was the human tradition. The grip was firm, almost challenging in its strength. "Thank you for hosting me, Colonel," Zekthor replied in the human language called English. His translator implant made the words flow naturally, though the sounds felt strange in his throat. "I am honored to observe your training methods." Colonel Webb smiled. Though Zekthor had learned that human smiles could mean many things. "We're pleased to have you here. This is the first time we've hosted an alien officer, so you'll have to forgive us if we're not sure of all the proper protocols." A younger human female joined them, also in uniform. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes were sharp and alert. "This is Lieutenant Katie Morris," Webb said. "She'll be your guide during your stay here." Katie saluted Zekthor in the human military style, hand to forehead. "It was adequate," Zekthor said. In truth, the human shuttle had been cramped and slow, but he saw no reason to insult his hosts. "Your planet is quite beautiful." From orbit, they began walking toward the main buildings. Zekthor noticed human cadets everywhere, young ones barely past adolescence by his estimation. They moved in organized groups, their uniforms identical, their movements synchronized. It reminded him of his own training days in the Vaxian military. Though these humans looked softer somehow, less imposing than Vaxian warriors. "Our academy has been training officers for over 200 years, Colonel Webb explained as they walked. "Every cadet here will graduate as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. They'll go on to lead soldiers in combat, peacekeeping operations, and various other missions." Zekthor nodded politely. 200 years seemed like a long time to humans, but the Vaxian Empire had been training warriors for over 3,000 years. His own military academy was older than human civilization itself. They entered a large stone building that Katie identified as the Academic Hall. Inside, the corridors were lined with portraits of humans in various military uniforms, spanning different time periods. Some of the uniforms looked ancient, almost comical in their design. "These are some of our most distinguished graduates," Katie explained, noticing his interest. "Generals, combat leaders, strategic planners. Many of them shaped human history." One portrait caught Zekthor's attention. The human in the painting wore an old-style uniform and had a stern expression. The nameplate read, "Grant. He was one of our greatest military commanders," Colonel Webb said. "He understood something fundamental about warfare that we still teach today. He knew that victory goes to whoever refuses to quit." Zekthor filed that information away. In Vaxian military doctrine, knowing when to retreat was considered a sign of wisdom. Fighting to the death was seen as wasteful and foolish. But he said nothing, not wanting to seem critical. They continued the tour through classrooms where cadets sat studying tactical maps and military theory. The technology was basic compared to Vaxian systems. Their computers were slow, their displays primitive. Zekthor felt a growing sense of confidence. These humans were clearly newcomers to the galactic stage, still working with outdated equipment and old ideas. In one classroom, an instructor was teaching a lesson on weapons systems. Zekthor paused to listen. The instructor, a man Katie identified as Major Greg Sullivan, was explaining the capabilities of human firearms. Our rifles have an effective range of about 500 meters, Sullivan was saying. Not as far as we'd like, but sufficient for most combat scenarios. Zekthor's own sidearm could hit targets at 3 times that distance. He felt almost sorry for these humans, with their limited technology. They moved on to the training grounds, where cadets were running obstacle courses and conducting physical fitness drills. The humans were sweating heavily in the afternoon heat, pushing their bodies hard. Zekthor watched one group doing something called push-ups, their faces red with effort. Physical fitness is a core part of our training, Katie explained. Every cadet must maintain strict standards throughout their 4 years here. Your species seems quite weak compared to most galactic races, Zekthor observed. He meant it as a simple statement of fact, not an insult. How do you compensate for this disadvantage? Katie's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. We make up for physical limitations with determination and creativity, Commander. A human soldier might not be as strong as a Vaxian, but we can be just as effective. They visited the barracks next, where cadets lived in small, Spartan rooms. Everything was organized, with military precision. Beds were made with tight corners, equipment stored in exact positions, personal items kept to a minimum. It was similar to Vaxian military standards, which surprised Zekthor slightly. At least these humans understood discipline. As the sun began to set, Colonel Webb led them to the officers' dining hall for dinner. Several other instructors joined them, including Major Sullivan, a woman introduced as Captain Linda Hayes, and a tactical instructor named Commander Ryan Clark. The meal was simple but well prepared, and the conversation was pleasant. The humans asked many questions about Vaxian military structure, training methods, and combat doctrine. Zekthor answered freely, seeing no harm in sharing such information. The Vaxian Empire was the dominant military power in this region of space. These humans were potential allies, not threats. They needed to understand how real military forces operated. Your tactics at the Battle of Krell Prime were impressive, Commander Clark said between bites of food. The double envelopment maneuver caught the Krell completely off guard. Zekthor felt a flash of surprise. That battle had occurred 15 years ago, long before humans had achieved faster-than-light travel. How did they know about it? You've studied our military campaigns? He asked. Of course. Clark replied casually. We've analyzed every recorded engagement we could find data on. Your people, the Krell, the Thorians, everyone. We want to understand how galactic warfare works. That seems wise, Zekthor said, though something about the human's tone unsettled him slightly. It was too casual, as if studying alien warfare was as normal as studying the weather. After dinner, Katie walked him to his guest quarters. The room was comfortable if basic, with a bed adjusted to accommodate his size and a window overlooking the academy grounds. In the distance, he could see lights from the cadet barracks and hear the faint sounds of humans conducting evening activities. Tomorrow we'll show you our simulation facilities and training exercises, Katie said from the doorway. I think you'll find them interesting. I look forward to it, Zekthor replied. After she left, he stood at the window for a long time, watching the human cadets move about below. They seemed so young, so inexperienced. Their technology was primitive, their weapons weak, their bodies fragile. The Vaxian Empire had nothing to fear from these newcomers, yet something nagged at the back of his mind. The way Commander Clark had casually mentioned studying Vaxian battles. The intensity in Katie's eyes when he'd mentioned human weakness. The portrait of General Grant and Colonel Webb's comment about refusing to quit. Zekthor shook his head, dismissing the thoughts. He was being paranoid. These were just humans, a newly spacefaring species, still learning their place in the galaxy. Nothing more. He settled into the bed and closed his eyes, unaware that everything he believed was about to change. The morning air was cool and crisp when Katie arrived at Zekthor's quarters. The sun was barely up, but the academy was already alive with activity. Cadets jogged past in formation, their breath visible in the early light, calling out rhythmic chants as they ran. Good morning, Commander, Katie said cheerfully. I hope you slept well. We have an interesting day planned. Zekthor had actually slept poorly. The bed was too soft, and the sounds of the human facility were unfamiliar. But he simply nodded and followed her outside. They walked across the grounds to a large building that Katie identified as the simulation center. Inside, the temperature was controlled and comfortable. Banks of computers lined the walls, and large screens displayed tactical maps and data streams. Human cadets sat at various stations, their faces focused and serious as they manipulated controls. This is where we run our tactical exercises, Katie explained. Cadets work through historical battles, theoretical scenarios, and real-world simulations. It helps them develop strategic thinking. A captain approached them, a young man with an easy smile. Commander Zekthor, I'm Captain Danny Foster. I oversee the simulation program. Lieutenant Morris tells me you might be interested in watching some of our exercises. I would be honored. Zekthor replied. Danny led them to a viewing area where they could see multiple screens at once. Right now, we have 4 teams running different scenarios. Each team has to work together to solve tactical problems. On the first screen, Zekthor saw a battle map that looked familiar. It took him a moment to recognize it as an ancient Earth battle. The terrain showed a narrow mountain pass. That's Thermopylae, Danny explained. An ancient battle from human history. 300 Spartan warriors held off a massive Persian army in that pass. The Spartans eventually lost, but they delayed the Persians long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare defenses. So the cadets are playing the role of the victorious Persians? Zekthor asked. Danny shook his head. No, they're playing the Spartans. Their job is to find a way to win. Zekthor felt confused. But the Spartans lost that battle. It's history. Exactly, Danny said with that unsettling human smile. We give our cadets historical defeats and ask them to find ways to change the outcome. It teaches them to think creatively and find solutions in impossible situations. Zekthor watched as the cadets manipulated their forces on the screen, trying different tactics and strategies. They failed repeatedly. But each time they tried something new, their instructor would reset the simulation, and they would start over with a different approach. On another screen, a different scenario played out. This one showed a frozen city with buildings reduced to rubble. Stalingrad, Katie said quietly. One of the bloodiest battles in human history. The city was reduced to ruins, but the defenders held on through winter and starvation. The cadets playing this scenario were attempting to hold key buildings against overwhelming odds. Zekthor watched as their virtual forces were pushed back again and again, but instead of surrendering, they kept finding new positions, new ways to resist, new tactics to slow the enemy advance. Why do they keep fighting when victory is clearly impossible? Zekthor asked. Danny looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Because in war, impossible is just another problem to solve. Sometimes, the act of resisting long enough is itself a form of victory. They moved to another viewing station where a third team was working through a naval battle scenario. The map showed islands and ocean, with ships positioned across a vast expanse of water. This is Midway, Katie explained. A battle from our Second World War. The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned, but through intelligence, timing, and a lot of courage, they destroyed most of the Japanese carrier fleet. This one, the humans won? Zekthor asked. Yes, Katie confirmed. But we still study it intensely. We analyze what could have gone wrong, what luck was involved, what decisions were critical. We don't just celebrate victories. We dissect them to understand why they worked. The morning continued with more simulations. Zekthor watched scenarios from wars he had never heard of, conflicts spanning thousands of years of human history. What disturbed him was the pattern he began to notice. Humans seemed obsessed with studying battles, where they were outnumbered, outgunned, or facing defeat. And in every case, they looked for ways to win anyway. At lunch, Danny invited several cadets to join them. Zekthor found himself sitting with Senior Cadet Alex Turner and Junior Cadet Casey Mitchell. Both young humans were eager to talk with an alien officer. "What do you think of our simulations, Commander?" Alex asked, biting into a sandwich. "They are interesting," Zekthor said carefully. "Though I notice you focus heavily on difficult scenarios." Casey nodded enthusiastically. "That's the whole point. Anyone can win when they have superior forces and better equipment. The real skill is winning when you shouldn't be able to. In Vaxian military doctrine," Zekthor explained, "we emphasize fighting from positions of strength. Superior numbers, better technology, tactical advantage. Fighting from weakness is considered poor strategy." Alex and Casey exchanged a glance. "That makes sense, if you always have those advantages," Alex said. "But what happens when you don't? What if you face an enemy with better technology or larger forces? Then you seek allies, gather intelligence, wait for a better opportunity," Zekthor replied. "Or you negotiate. Or you fight anyway and find a way to win," Casey said quietly. There was something in the young human's voice that made Zekthor uncomfortable. It wasn't arrogance, exactly. It was certainty, as if fighting impossible battles and finding ways to win was simply what humans did. "I've been studying some of your people's battles, Commander," Casey continued, pulling out a datapad. "The Vaxian Krell War, specifically. Very impressive tactics." Zekthor felt that flash of surprise again. "How did you access information about that conflict? Those records should not be available to non-Vaxian military personnel." Casey shrugged. "Information finds a way, sir. Anyway, I noticed something interesting about your pincer formation at the Battle of Krell Prime. It's brilliant, really. You force the enemy into a pocket and give them one route of retreat, then destroy them as they flee through the gap." "Yes," Zekthor said slowly. "It's a classic maneuver. But it only works if the enemy retreats," Casey pointed out. "Your entire strategy depends on the assumption that when faced with encirclement, the enemy will try to escape through the gap you've left open. What happens if they don't retreat? What if they turn and attack one arm of the pincer with everything they have?" Zekthor opened his mouth and then closed it. No Vaxian tactician had ever asked that question, because retreat in the face of encirclement was the logical choice. Every civilized military force would make that choice. The alternative was to accept massive casualties for no tactical gain. "The losses would be unacceptable," he finally said. "To you," Alex said. "But acceptable losses are relative, aren't they? If my choice is certain death or probable death with a chance of breaking through, I might choose the second option." "That would be irrational," Zekthor protested. "Maybe," Casey agreed. "But humans have a history of being irrational when it comes to survival. We have this saying, 'It's not about the size of the dog in the fight. It's about the size of the fight in the dog.' And well, ask. Danny joined the conversation then. "The cadets make a good point, Commander. Different species have different thresholds for acceptable risk and casualties. Understanding those differences is crucial in warfare." After lunch, they returned to the simulation center. This time, Danny showed Zekthor something that made his blood run cold. On one of the screens was a simulation of a Vaxian battle group engaging with human forces. "This is theoretical, of course," Danny said. "We've never fought your people, and we hope we never do. But part of our job is to prepare for every possibility." Zekthor watched the simulation play out. The Vaxian forces had superior technology and numbers. In the first run, they crushed the human forces easily. But then the simulation reset, and the human tactics changed. They used guerrilla strikes, asymmetric warfare, targeted attacks on supply lines. The Vaxian forces still won, but at a much higher cost. The simulation reset again. This time the human forces scattered and reformed, refusing to engage in direct battle. They hit and ran, struck and vanished, bled the Vaxian forces slowly over time. The simulation ran for months of compressed time. The Vaxian forces eventually controlled the territory, but their casualties mounted steadily. In a war of attrition against humans, who do you think wins? Danny asked quietly. Zekthor didn't answer. He was thinking about something Casey had said. Acceptable losses are relative. The Vaxian Empire had a population of 12 billion, spread across 3 star systems. Earth alone had 8 billion humans. How many simulations like this have you run? He asked. Hundreds, Danny admitted. Against every major galactic power we have data on. We analyze strengths, weaknesses, probable tactics, technological advantages. We look for ways to counter superior forces. But why? Zekthor felt his frustration growing. Humanity has just joined the galactic community. You are surrounded by potential allies and trading partners. Why prepare for war? Why? Katie spoke up from beside him. We prepare for war, so we never have to fight one. If everyone knows that attacking humanity would be costly, maybe no one will try. It's called deterrence through strength. But you are not strong, Zekthor said. Your technology is generations behind most galactic races. Right now, yes, Alex said. But Commander, we've only had access to galactic technology for 3 years. 3 years ago, we didn't know aliens existed. Now we're studying your weapons, your ships, your tactics. How long do you think it will take us to catch up? The question hung in the air like a threat. Zekthor looked around the simulation center at the dozens of young humans working at their stations, studying warfare, analyzing battles, learning from every conflict in human and alien history. They were preparing, not for a specific war, but for any war. All wars. I think I need some air, Zekthor said quietly. Katie led him outside. The afternoon sun was warm, but Zekthor felt cold inside. Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of these humans. They weren't primitive newcomers stumbling into galactic society. They were predators that had spent 10,000 years learning to kill each other. And now they were applying those lessons to a galactic scale. Are you all right, Commander? Katie asked, with apparent concern. I am fine, Zekthor lied. But he wasn't fine. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Zekthor felt something he had never experienced in his military career. He felt afraid. The third morning, at West Point, began with rain. Zekthor watched water stream down his window and thought about requesting an early departure. What he had seen yesterday troubled him deeply, and he wasn't sure he wanted to learn more about human military thinking. But his orders were clear. He was to complete the full week-long observation and report back to Vaxian Command with a complete assessment. Colonel Webb greeted him at breakfast with his usual warm smile. Commander, I hope you're finding your stay educational. Today I thought you might enjoy sitting in on one of our history lectures. Professor Helen Grant teaches a course on military history that's quite popular with our cadets. That would be acceptable, Zekthor replied, though his appetite had diminished. The human food sat heavily in his stomach. The lecture hall was large and tiered, with seats arranged in ascending rows. Nearly 200 cadets filled the space, their uniforms crisp and their attention focused on the front, where an older human woman stood. Professor Grant had gray hair and sharp eyes behind thin glasses. She looked more like a warrior than many soldiers Zekthor had met. Good morning, she said as Webb led Zekthor to a seat near the back. Class, we have a special guest today. Commander Zekthor of the Vaxian Empire is observing our session. I'm sure we'll all make a good impression. She smiled, and the cadets turned to look at him briefly before returning their attention forward. Today's topic, Professor Grant began, writing on a large display screen, is asymmetric warfare and the human tradition. Specifically, we're going to discuss how weaker forces defeat stronger ones. She pulled up an image of ancient warriors with shields and spears. Let's start with the Battle of Marathon, 490 BCE. The Persians landed on Greek shores with a force estimated at 25,000 soldiers. The Athenians had about 10,000. The Greeks were outnumbered, more than 2 to 1. The Athenians won, a cadet called out. Yes? But how? Professor Grant asked. What did they do differently? Another cadet raised her hand. They studied Persian tactics beforehand. They knew the Persians relied on their center formation being strongest, so the Greeks made their center weak on purpose and strengthened their flanks instead. Exactly, Professor Grant said. They took what should have been a weakness and turned it into a strategy. The Persians pushed through the Greek center just as expected, but then the Greek flanks closed in from both sides. The Persians were surrounded and routed. The key lesson here is adaptation based on intelligence. She moved to the next image, showing what looked like forests and rough terrain. Let's jump forward to the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. The British military was the most powerful in the world at that time. Professional soldiers, superior training, better equipment, naval supremacy. The American colonists were farmers and merchants with hunting rifles. Yet the Americans won, Professor Grant continued. Instead of fighting the way Europeans fought, with armies meeting in open fields, they used guerrilla tactics. They attacked supply lines, used terrain to their advantage, forced the British to fight a type of war they weren't prepared for. Zekthor listened with growing unease. This was exactly what he had seen in the simulations yesterday. Humans, studying how to win from positions of weakness. Professor Grant continued through history. She discussed the Vietnam War, where a technologically inferior force defeated the most powerful military on Earth through persistence and unconventional tactics. She analyzed the Soviet-Afghan War, where mountain fighters with basic weapons drove out a superpower. She examined insurgencies, rebellions, and resistance movements spanning thousands of years. With each example, a pattern emerged. Humans facing superior enemies didn't surrender. They adapted. They found weaknesses. They changed tactics. They endured. What I want you to understand, Professor Grant said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, is that throughout human history, we have never encountered a weapon we couldn't eventually counter, a tactic we couldn't overcome, or an enemy we couldn't outlast. The question is never if we will find a way to win. The question is only how long it will take, and what price we're willing to pay. A chill ran through Zekthor's body. This wasn't just military theory. This was a statement of belief, almost religious in its certainty. A cadet raised his hand. Professor, what about battles we absolutely lost, where there was no victory? Good question, Professor Grant said. Give me an example. The fall of Constantinople, the cadet suggested. The Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Turks. Professor Grant nodded. The Byzantines lost that battle. Yes. Their empire ended. But did they lose the war? She pulled up images of art, architecture, and texts. Byzantine culture, knowledge, and traditions survived. Many Byzantine scholars fled to Europe, bringing their knowledge with them. Some historians argue that this influx of Byzantine learning helped spark the Renaissance. So even in defeat, Byzantine civilization continued its influence. That's the thing about humans. We survive. Our ideas survive. Our culture survives. You can win every battle and still not truly defeat us. During the break, Zekthor stood to stretch his legs. A senior cadet approached him. A young man who introduced himself as Justin Blake. Commander Zekthor, sir. I hope you don't mind me asking, but what do you think of our lecture so far? It is very thorough, Zekthor said carefully. Your professor is clearly knowledgeable. I actually have a project I've been working on that you might find interesting, Justin said, pulling out a datapad. It's about theoretical combat scenarios between different species. Would you like to see? Zekthor's curiosity overcame his growing dread. Show me. Justin activated the pad and displayed a complex simulation. This is a scenario involving Vaxian forces and human forces in a prolonged conflict. I've tried to be as accurate as possible with the data I could find. The simulation showed multiple engagements over a span of years. In the early battles, Vaxian forces dominated completely. Their superior technology and training gave them overwhelming advantages. Human casualties were severe, but as the simulation progressed, things changed. Human tactics evolved. They stopped trying to match Vaxian forces directly, and instead focused on logistics, communications, and isolated units. The Vaxian advantages began to diminish as humans adapted, captured, or salvaged technology. By year 3 of the conflict, Justin explained, human forces have begun producing weapons based on modified Vaxian technology. Not as good as the originals, but good enough. And we're improving faster than you can adapt because we're used to rapid technological change. The simulation continued. By year 5, casualties on both sides were roughly equal despite Vaxian technological superiority. By year 7, human forces had numerical superiority and technological parity. By year 10, the Vaxian forces were being pushed back. This is one possible outcome, Justin said. I've run the simulation hundreds of times with different variables. In about 70% of long-term scenarios, humans eventually win through adaptation and numbers. In another 20%, it's a stalemate that could last decades. Only in about 10% of scenarios do Vaxians maintain their advantage long enough to force human surrender. These are just theoretical projections, Zekthor said, though his voice sounded weak even to himself. Yes, sir, Justin agreed. But they're based on historical patterns of human warfare and what we know about Vaxian military doctrine. I could be wrong about a lot of things, but the fundamental pattern holds. We adapt faster than most species because we've had to. We've spent thousands of years fighting each other, and each war taught us new lessons. Professor Grant called the class back to order. Justin returned to his seat, leaving Zekthor to process what he had seen. The second half of the lecture focused on modern warfare. Professor Grant discussed conflicts from the 21st century, battles fought with drones, cyber attacks, and precision weapons. She analyzed counterinsurgency operations, urban warfare, and hybrid conflicts. What you need to understand about modern human warfare, she said, is that we've learned to fight on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical combat, information warfare, economic pressure, diplomatic isolation. We don't just fight armies anymore. We fight entire systems. She pulled up a chart showing casualty ratios from various conflicts. Notice something interesting? As our technology has improved, we've become more effective at winning while taking fewer casualties. But we never forgot the lessons from our history. We still know how to win ugly if we have to. We still know how to fight outnumbered and outgunned. A cadet asked, Professor, what's your assessment of humanity's place in galactic military power rankings? Professor Grant was quiet for a moment. Right now, we're near the bottom. Most alien species have technology that's generations ahead of ours. In a direct conventional war with any major galactic power, we'd lose badly. She paused, and Zekthor saw that hard look in her eyes again. But wars aren't won in simulations or on paper. They're won by soldiers who refuse to quit. And humans are very, very good at not quitting. Give us 10 years of access to galactic technology, and we'll be competitive. Give us 20 years, and we'll be dangerous. Give us 50 years, and we'll be the military power no one wants to fight. Why are you so confident about that? Another cadet asked. Because of who we are, Professor Grant replied simply. Every species in the galaxy had an evolutionary path. Most evolved on worlds with balanced ecosystems, where cooperation and survival went hand in hand. Earth is different. Earth has tried to kill us repeatedly. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, plagues, natural disasters. We survived it all. Then we started killing each other. 10,000 years of constant warfare. And we survived that too. She advanced to a new slide showing Earth from space. We're not the strongest species. We're not the fastest or the smartest. But we're the most persistent. We're the species that looked at fire and said, I'm going to control that. We looked at flight and said, I'm going to do that. We looked at space and said, I'm going to go there. And now we're looking at the galaxy and saying, we belong here too. The lecture ended shortly after. As the cadets filed out, many of them glanced at Zekthor with expressions he couldn't quite read. Pride, perhaps, or determination. Colonel Webb approached him as the hall emptied. What did you think of the lecture, Commander? Zekthor struggled to find words. It was enlightening. Your professor is very passionate about her subject. Helen lost her son in the last Earth War before we achieved global peace, Webb said quietly. She understands the cost of warfare better than most, but she also understands its necessity. We're preparing these cadets for a galaxy that might not be friendly. The galaxy is peaceful, Zekthor protested. The Galactic Council maintains order. Wars between member species are rare. For now, Webb said. But history teaches us that peace is temporary. Empires rise and fall. Alliances shift. Resources become scarce. Eventually, someone decides that war is worth the cost. When that happens, we need to make sure that someone isn't looking at Earth as an easy target. They walked outside into the rain. Zekthor looked up at the gray sky and thought about his home world, where rain fell in different colors depending on the atmospheric conditions. Everything about Earth was different, including its dominant species. Commander, can I ask you a direct question? Of course. If war broke out between our people, who do you think would win? Zekthor was silent for a long time. The truth was, he no longer knew the answer. The fourth day dawned clear and cold. Zekthor had barely slept again. His mind kept replaying everything he had witnessed. The simulations of defeat turned into studies of adaptation. The lecture about humanity's refusal to accept loss. The casual certainty with which these young humans discussed winning wars against technologically superior enemies. Colonel Webb met him for breakfast with his usual pleasant manner. But Zekthor was beginning to understand that the colonel's friendliness masked a sharper edge. These humans were experts at appearing harmless while preparing for violence. Today I thought you might enjoy seeing our survival training program, Webb said as they ate. It's one of the most challenging aspects of our cadet education. Major Amy Peterson runs the program. She's quite good at what she does. End quote. They drove to a facility on the edge of the academy grounds. The building was plain and functional, surrounded by dense forest. Inside, they found Major Peterson briefing a group of cadets who looked tired and dirty. Their uniforms were torn in places, and several had visible bruises. Major Peterson was a compact woman with short dark hair and scars on her hands that spoke of hard experience. She saluted Colonel Webb and extended a hand to Zekthor. Welcome, Commander. The Colonel tells me you're interested in our survival training. I am curious about your methods, Zekthor replied. Well, you're in luck. We're running a final exercise today for these cadets. They've been in the field for 3 days with minimal supplies, and now they're going through their extraction scenarios. Would you like to observe? Zekthor agreed, and they moved to an observation room with screens showing multiple camera angles of the surrounding forest. The cadets had dispersed into the woods, and Major Peterson explained that they were being hunted by instructors playing the role of enemy forces. The scenario is simple, she explained. They've been operating behind enemy lines. Their mission is complete, but now they have to survive and evade capture until extraction. They started with basic gear, but most of it has been lost during simulated combat. Now they have to make do with almost nothing. On the screens, Zekthor watched a female cadet moving carefully through thick undergrowth. Her uniform was caked with mud, and she carried only a small knife. She paused frequently to listen and scan her surroundings. That's Cadet Jennifer Price, Major Peterson said. She's been out there for 72 hours, with about 6 hours of total sleep, minimal food, and no communication equipment. 3 instructors are actively hunting her. What happens if they catch her? Zekthor asked. She goes through interrogation resistance training, Peterson replied. Nothing that causes permanent harm, but uncomfortable enough to teach important lessons about mental resilience. On another screen, a male cadet was constructing some kind of trap using branches and what looked like pieces of wire. Cadet Scott Baker, Peterson noted. He's setting up an early warning system, so he can sleep for a few hours. Smart. Thinking. What disturbed Zekthor was how effective these humans were at surviving in hostile conditions. They drank water from streams after treating it with tablets. They ate plants they identified as safe. They constructed shelter from natural materials. One cadet even caught a small animal and prepared it for eating. In Vaxian military training, Zekthor said slowly, we teach survival basics, but we expect our soldiers to be resupplied regularly. Our logistics network is very efficient. That's smart if your logistics hold up, Peterson agreed. But what happens if they don't? What if supply lines are cut or you're stranded behind enemy lines? Our philosophy is that every soldier should be able to survive and operate independently if necessary. They watched for another hour as the cadets evaded their pursuers, solved problems, and demonstrated remarkable endurance. One cadet was finally caught after putting up a brief fight. They took him to another area where Zekthor could observe the interrogation training. The instructors playing enemy soldiers were not gentle. They shouted questions, made threats, and used psychological pressure. The cadet gave only basic information as he had been trained. Nothing that would compromise his unit or mission. Even when they left him alone, in a cold, dark room for what must have felt like hours, he maintained his composure. How long does this training last? Zekthor asked. The interrogation resistance portion? Usually, 24 to 48 hours, Peterson replied. Long enough to teach them what it feels like, how to resist, and how to maintain hope, even in terrible circumstances. A new group of cadets entered the facility, looking fresh and alert. Major Peterson explained that these were about to begin a different type of training, focused on operating with injuries. Commander, this next part might be disturbing, she warned. We use realistic casualty simulations to teach combat medicine and how to keep fighting when wounded. In the training room, instructors fitted the cadets with devices that simulated various injuries. One cadet's device made his leg feel as though it was broken. Another simulated a severe wound to the arm. A third created intense pain signals that mimicked a torso injury. Now they have to complete mission objectives while dealing with these simulated injuries, Peterson explained. They learn to push through pain, treat their wounds, and continue operating. Zekthor watched in fascinated horror as the cadets struggled through an obstacle course while experiencing simulated traumatic injuries. They fell, got up, helped each other, and kept moving forward, even though every instinct must have been screaming at them to stop. This seems cruel, Zekthor said quietly. It's necessary, Peterson replied without apology. In real combat, soldiers get hurt. The ones who survive are the ones who can keep functioning despite their injuries. We need to train that response. Tupper. After lunch, they visited the medical training facility where a doctor named Chris Monroe was teaching a class on combat trauma. Dr. Monroe was explaining something called the stress response in humans. Your body produces chemicals called hormones during high-stress situations, he told the cadets. Adrenaline, cortisol, endorphins. These chemicals do something remarkable. They allow you to ignore pain, increase your strength, sharpen your focus, and keep fighting even when you should be incapacitated. He showed brain scans and medical data. There are documented cases of soldiers continuing to fight with injuries that should have made them unconscious. Severed limbs, punctured organs, massive blood loss. The human body, when pushed to its limit, can override its own safety mechanisms. Zekthor felt sick. In Vaxian physiology, serious injury triggered an immediate shutdown response to prevent further damage. It was a survival mechanism that existed in most intelligent species. The body forced itself to stop before injuries became fatal. But humans could fight past that point. They could push their bodies until they literally died from their wounds, all while still engaging the enemy. Dr. Monroe, Zekthor interrupted. Surely this is dangerous. If soldiers ignore serious injuries, they could die from wounds that might otherwise be survivable. That's absolutely true, Commander, Monroe agreed. That's why we also train extensive combat first aid. Every soldier is taught to assess and treat injuries in the field. The goal is to use that stress response to stay in the fight long enough to accomplish the mission or reach safety, then get proper medical treatment. He pulled up a video showing training exercises where cadets practiced treating severe injuries on each other. They learned to stop bleeding, stabilize broken bones, and even perform emergency procedures that made Zekthor's stomach turn. The key is knowing your limits, Monroe continued. A good soldier knows the difference between pain that means stop and pain that means keep going. We train them to make that distinction under pressure. As the day wore on, Zekthor saw more training that challenged his understanding of warfare. He watched cadets learn to create improvised explosives from common materials. He saw them practice making communication devices from salvaged parts. He observed training in how to turn civilian environments into defensive positions. Everything was about resourcefulness, adaptation, and refusing to quit. Every exercise assumed that humans would face superior enemies with better equipment. Every lesson was about finding ways to win anyway. Late in the afternoon, Major Peterson took them to watch the final extraction of the survival exercise cadets. Helicopter sounds filled the air as the remaining cadets emerged from the forest, exhausted but triumphant. They had evaded capture for 3 full days, with almost no equipment in terrain filled with people actively hunting them. As the cadets boarded the helicopters, Zekthor noticed their expressions. They weren't just tired. They were proud. They had proved something to themselves and each other. That evening, Colonel Webb invited Major Sullivan to join them for dinner. Sullivan was the instructor Zekthor had met on the first day, and he seemed to enjoy discussing military theory. "I've been thinking about your pincer maneuver," Sullivan said casually between bites. "The one you used at Krell Prime. It really is elegant. But I keep coming back to a question that Cadet Mitchell raised. What happens when the enemy doesn't retreat through your gap?" Zekthor felt his frustration rising. "I told the cadet. The casualties would be unacceptable. No rational commander would make that choice." "Unacceptable to who?" Sullivan pressed. "You can try to retreat through the gap and probably get destroyed piecemeal, or you can concentrate all your forces and punch through one arm of the encirclement. Yes. You'll take heavy losses. Maybe 60 or 70% casualties. But the 30% who break through survive and can regroup. What choice do you make?" Zekthor wanted to say that no commander would accept 70% losses, but he had spent the day watching human cadets learn to function with simulated broken bones and punctured organs. He had seen them train to keep fighting when they should stop. He had listened to a doctor explain how human bodies could ignore fatal injuries. "You would attack the pincer," he said quietly. "Probably." Sullivan agreed. "Because 30% of my force surviving is better than 0% surviving. And those survivors would be very, very angry. They'd remember what happened. They'd come back stronger, with new tactics, determined to never be caught in that trap again." "How do you stop human soldiers if they don't stop when they should be stopped?" Zekthor asked, repeating the question that had haunted him since yesterday. Sullivan's expression grew serious. "You don't stop individual humans, Commander. You have to eliminate all of them. And there are 8 billion of us on Earth alone. We're already establishing colonies on other worlds in this system. Soon we'll have populations spread across multiple planets. At that point, defeating humanity doesn't just mean winning battles. It means committing genocide on a scale that most species would find impossible to contemplate." The words hung in the air like a threat and a promise. Zekthor realized with growing horror that this was the point. The humans weren't just training soldiers. They were sending a message to anyone who might consider attacking Earth. A message that said attacking humanity would cost more than any victory could possibly be worth. "I need to rest," Zekthor said, standing abruptly. "Thank you for dinner." As he walked back to his quarters through the evening darkness, Zekthor could hear cadets training in the distance. They never stopped. Day and night, these humans prepared for wars they hoped would never come, but assumed eventually would, and the most terrifying part was that they might be right. The fifth and final morning arrived with bright sunshine that felt wrong given Zekthor's dark thoughts. He had spent another sleepless night reviewing everything he had witnessed during his stay at West Point. Each observation built on the last, creating a picture that deeply disturbed him. Colonel Webb seemed to sense his mood at breakfast. "Today's your last day with us. Commander. I've arranged for you to observe something special. Our senior cadets are presenting their strategic thesis projects. These represent the culmination of 4 years of study and training." They walked to a conference room where several senior cadets waited with their presentation materials ready. Maps covered the walls, and data displays showed complex strategic models. The cadets stood when Colonel Webb entered, their bearing professional and confident. "Commander Zekthor, these are some of our best tactical minds," Webb said. "Cadet Commander Nicole Perry will present first, followed by Cadet Commander Jake Harrison. Both have spent the year developing strategic frameworks that could shape future human military doctrine." Nicole Perry was a tall woman with sharp features and intelligent eyes. She activated her presentation with practiced ease. "Good morning, sir. Good morning, sir. My thesis examines first contact scenarios with potentially hostile alien civilizations and proposes response frameworks for Earth Defense Forces." The presentation was methodical and thorough. Nicole outlined various scenarios ranging from accidental conflict to deliberate invasion. For each scenario, she proposed responses that shared a common theme. Gather intelligence first. Prepare for worst-case outcomes. Never assume friendly intentions. "The key assumption driving my framework," Nicole explained, "is that any alien civilization capable of interstellar travel has likely faced and won conflicts during its development. They are by definition survivors. We must assume they have military capabilities and the willingness to use them." End quote. She pulled up a detailed analysis of Vaxian military capabilities. Zekthor felt his pulse quicken as he saw how much information humans had gathered about his people's weapons, ships, and tactics. Some of this data should have been classified. In a scenario involving conflict with the Vaxian Empire, Nicole continued calmly, "our initial technological disadvantage would be severe. Vaxian energy weapons have approximately triple the effective range of our projectile weapons. Their ships are faster, and their shields more robust." She advanced to the next slide, and Zekthor felt cold dread. However, Vaxian military doctrine shows consistent patterns that create exploitable weaknesses. First, they rely heavily on technological superiority and become less effective when that advantage is neutralized. Second, they have cultural resistance to accepting high casualties, which limits their tactical flexibility. Third, their command structure is highly centralized, creating vulnerability to decapitation strikes. The presentation continued with proposed human responses to each Vaxian advantage. Nicole suggested immediate technological espionage to acquire Vaxian weapons specifications. She recommended dispersed command structures that could function even if Earth command was destroyed. She proposed asymmetric tactics that would force Vaxian forces into ground engagements where human numbers would matter more than technological edge. "The goal is not to match Vaxian capabilities," Nicole concluded. "The goal is to make any conflict so costly that victory becomes meaningless. We call this strategy denial through unacceptable cost." Colonel Webb thanked Nicole and invited Jake Harrison to present next. Jake was shorter, but moved with quiet confidence. His presentation began with a simple question displayed on the screen. How do you defeat an enemy you can't match? Every species approaches warfare through their cultural lens. Jake began. They develop rules, often unstated, about acceptable behavior in combat. These rules exist for good reasons. They prevent unnecessary suffering and allow for conflict resolution short of total war. But these rules are also vulnerabilities. He brought up examples from human history. Wars where one side followed established conventions, while the other side ignored them. Conflicts where unconventional tactics defeated superior forces, precisely because they violated expected patterns. I call this doctrine shock, Jake explained. The strategic use of unexpected tactics to create psychological and operational paralysis in the enemy. When an opponent doesn't understand why you're doing what you're doing, they can't effectively respond. Zekthor listened with growing horror as Jake outlined specific examples. Retreat when you should attack. Attack when you should retreat. Spread forces when concentration is expected. Ignore valuable objectives to strike at unexpected targets. Fight to the death over worthless positions to confuse enemy assessments of your priorities. The key is that these tactics only work because they violate assumptions, Jake continued. Most species assume warfare follows logical patterns. Attack valuable targets. Preserve your forces. Seek advantageous engagements. But humans have demonstrated throughout our history that we're willing to be illogical if it serves our strategic goals. He pulled up data on human conflicts that made Zekthor's head spin. During something called World War II, human forces had fought viciously over a city called Stalingrad that had limited strategic value, simply because surrendering it would have been psychologically devastating. In a war in Vietnam, humans had accepted enormous casualties for years to prove they wouldn't be intimidated by a larger adversary. Every species has rules about war, Jake said, looking directly at Zekthor. Those rules are based on what they consider rational, acceptable, or honorable. Humans have rules too, but we've also broken every rule we've ever made when survival was at stake. That unpredictability is a weapon. After the presentations, Colonel Webb dismissed the cadets and invited Zekthor to walk with him across the academy grounds. The morning was beautiful, with cadets drilling in formation and others attending classes. Everything looked normal and peaceful. But Zekthor now understood what he was really seeing. These weren't students. They were weapons being forged. Each one was learning not just tactics and strategy, but a way of thinking about warfare that was fundamentally different from anything in Vaxian culture. They were learning to be unpredictable, relentless, and willing to pay any price for victory. You seem troubled, Commander, Webb observed as they walked. Zekthor stopped and turned to face the colonel. Your people are not preparing to join the galactic community. You are preparing to survive it, even if it means war with everyone. Webb was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. That's not entirely fair, Commander. We want peace. We hope for friendship and cooperation with alien species, but hope is not a strategy. Wishing for peace doesn't guarantee it, so you prepare for war, Zekthor said. We prepare to ensure no one can threaten Earth, Webb corrected. There's a difference. We're not planning to attack anyone, but we're making certain that attacking us would be the worst decision any species could make. I see. They resumed walking. Webb continued speaking, his voice calm but firm. You've seen our simulations, our history lessons, our survival courses. You've watched us study defeat and learn from failure. All of this probably seems aggressive or paranoid from your perspective. It seems dangerous, Zekthor replied honestly. You are teaching your young people to think of war as inevitable and victory as the only acceptable outcome. Because for humanity, those things have always been true, Webb said. Commander, your people have 3,000 years of recorded history. You fought wars, yes, but you also had long periods of peace. Your evolutionary path was relatively stable. You developed technology gradually and spread across multiple star systems without facing extinction-level threats. He gestured toward the sky. Earth is different. We've faced extinction repeatedly. Ice ages that reduced our population to a few thousand individuals. Plagues that killed a third of our population. World wars that threatened to destroy our entire civilization. We survived all of it, but we learned something in the process. We learned that survival is never guaranteed. That peace is temporary. That the only way to protect ourselves is to be so dangerous that no one dares attack us. They reached an overlook where they could see the entire academy spread out below. Hundreds of cadets moved through their daily routines, preparing for futures as military officers. You asked me the other day who would win if our peoples went to war. Zekthor was silent for a long time. His military training told him that Vaxian forces would win any direct engagement. Better technology, better ships, professional warriors with centuries of combat tradition. But everything he had witnessed this week whispered a different answer. In the short term, Vaxian forces would dominate. He finally said, "We would win battle after battle. We would control space around Earth. We would force your military into retreat. And in the long term?" Webb prompted. "In the long term, humanity would adapt," Zekthor admitted. "You would study our tactics and find weaknesses. You would steal or reverse engineer our technology. You would drag the war out, making it cost more and more until the price of victory exceeded its value. You would fight in ways we don't expect, using tactics we consider irrational. And you would never surrender, no matter how many battles you lost." Webb nodded slowly. "That's a fair assessment. Now imagine you're a Vaxian strategic planner. Knowing all of that, would you recommend war with humanity?" "No," Zekthor said immediately. "The cost would be unacceptable." "That's exactly the point," Webb said. "We're not hoping for peace, Commander. We're guaranteeing it through the promise of absolute war. Every species that learns what you've learned this week will reach the same conclusion. Attacking Earth isn't worth it. And that's how we survive in a galaxy full of species more advanced than we are." They walked back toward the main building in silence. Zekthor's mind raced through the implications of everything he had learned. The Vaxian Empire needed to know about this, but how could he explain it? How could he convey the fundamental difference in how humans approached warfare? "May I speak candidly, Colonel?" Zekthor asked. "Of course. Your people terrify me," Zekthor said simply. "Not because of your weapons or your ships. Those are primitive compared to ours. You terrify me because you've turned suffering into strategy. Because you've made defeat into a learning opportunity. Because you refuse to accept any outcome except ultimate victory, regardless of the cost." Webb's expression softened slightly. "I understand that feeling, Commander. We terrify ourselves sometimes. The things humans have done to each other throughout our history are horrifying. The weapons we've created, the wars we've fought, the suffering we've inflicted. We know what we're capable of. And you've brought all of that knowledge to the stars," Zekthor said. "Yes," Webb agreed. "But we've also brought our capacity for mercy, for cooperation, for building something better than ourselves. Humans are capable of both extreme violence and profound compassion. We just needed to make sure that anyone considering attacking us understands the violence part first." As they reached the administration building, Webb extended his hand one final time. "Thank you for spending this week with us, Commander. I hope it's been educational." Webb is Webb. One final time, Zekthor grasped the human's hand, feeling the strength in that grip. "More than you know, Colonel." Several hours later, Zekthor sat in his shuttle as it prepared for departure. Through the viewport, he could see West Point below, looking peaceful in the afternoon sun. Somewhere down there, cadets were still training, still studying warfare, still preparing for conflicts that might never come, but that they assumed eventually would. He had written his report during the flight preparation. It was thorough and detailed, covering everything he had observed. But he knew that no amount of data could truly convey what he had learned. The Vaxian Empire had protocols for evaluating military threats based on technology, numbers, and strategic capability. But those protocols didn't account for species that refused to lose. They didn't factor in adaptation, speed, or psychological warfare, or cultural attitudes toward acceptable casualties. The final paragraph of his report was simple and direct. Recommendation: avoid conflict with humanity at all costs. If war becomes unavoidable, commit to complete extinction immediately. Any protracted conflict will result in Vaxian defeat. Humanity does not fight wars to win. They fight wars to ensure their enemies cannot threaten them again. This makes them the most dangerous species I have encountered. As the shuttle lifted off and accelerated toward orbit, Zekthor looked back at the blue planet below. It looked so peaceful, so beautiful. But he knew the truth now. That planet had spent billions of years trying to kill its dominant species, and that species had responded by becoming unkillable. The galaxy had just gained a new member species, and most civilizations didn't understand what that meant. They saw humans as primitive, as technologically backward, as newcomers who needed guidance and protection. But Zekthor had seen behind that facade. He had witnessed what humans really were. They were survivors. They were adapters. They were warriors who had spent 10,000 years learning to defeat each other, and had now turned that expertise toward the stars. They were a species that studied failure more than success, because they understood that learning from defeat was more valuable than celebrating victory. Most terrifying of all, they were a species that prepared for wars they refused to lose. As the shuttle jumped to faster-than-light travel, Zekthor closed his eyes and tried to rest. But sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw human cadets training. He heard Professor Grant's voice explaining how humans never encountered an enemy they couldn't outlast. He remembered Jake Harrison's presentation on Doctrine Shock and Nicole Perry's framework for defeating technologically superior foes. The Vaxian Empire would receive his report and make their decisions. Maybe they would take his warnings seriously. Maybe they would understand that humanity represented a fundamental shift in galactic power dynamics. Or maybe they would dismiss his concerns as paranoia and continue treating humans as primitive newcomers. Zekthor hoped they would listen. Because if they didn't, if the Vaxian Empire or any other galactic power decided to test humanity's resolve, they would discover what he had learned this week. You don't defeat humans by winning battles. You defeat them by being willing to fight forever, to pay any cost, to sacrifice everything for victory. And most species in the galaxy weren't capable of that level of commitment, but humans were. They had proved it thousands of times throughout their history, and now they had brought that terrible determination to the stars. The galaxy would never be the same.